Elisabeth, you have the ability to see the deceased, and you can also speak with them. You have also had visits from deceased persons you have known during their earthly life. Could you tell us about these encounters? Yes, I would be very happy sharing some of my experiences with you. Let's start with Ernesto. I had known Ernesto in his earthly life. He was an entrepreneur in the region, and we met here and there. And shortly after he retired, he passed away quite suddenly. And at that time, he came back. And this was 8 or 9 years ago. So calculating from where we are now, 2022, 23, yes, that was 8 or 9 years ago, when he suddenly presented himself here in counseling. And when I said to him, Ernesto, what are you doing here? And he replied, well, it's so nice and warm here with you. And then we were talking about this and that. But of course, I don't remember anymore what we were specifically talking about. And then for years, I didn't see him. At least, I didn't perceive him in particular. And just now, this past Easter, he was suddenly here. And this actually surprised me. And I asked him, how did you get here? And what are you doing here? He then said, it's been a long time since I was given earth leave. And when I asked him further, how is it over there? What does it look like over there? And so on. And then he said that he lived in a plain house, in one of the brown wooden houses that are over there. And what was striking was that there was no landscaping at all. Nothing like that. There were no gardens, no bushes, no flowers, nothing. But a little further away, there was a meadow and a small river where some beings go hiking and so on. But, he said, I am happy and grateful to live on. And he emphasized several times that he was really happy and grateful that life continues. Then we remembered together an event in his earthly life. That is, that we had been invited to have a special meal together at his home. And we were sitting at a very large table for 12 people. And his wife pointed to a neighboring table, saying, I couldn't clear that table because Ernesto has so many books, which he says are not to be put away, because he wants them kept one book parallel to the other. So then he looked over this long table and said to me, well, I could discuss this with you because I am dealing with the topic of reincarnation. And this was then a bit embarrassing. And that's why I asked him, well, how do you imagine a life based on what is written in these books, or at all? He replied, after studying these books, I came to the conclusion that when I die, the spirit and soul will leave my body. And then somewhere in the universe, I am a kind of energy cloud, waiting to reincarnate again on Earth. I shook my head somewhat, whereupon he said, you know, this is written in a book, but let me repeat that I am happy and grateful that I can continue to live in this state of being. Every now and then, a kind of controller comes over here. Excuse me for calling him that, because it's really a higher being. Well, sometimes he comes along, and he seems very well disposed toward me, and he tells me, Ernesto, listen to me. You should develop further. You do have to move on in your life. But my friend Ernesto said that he actually didn't understand the message behind it. I then asked him if he would always be living alone in this house, and he answered, well, the houses here aren't as big as a spacious garden house on Earth, but once another being was brought along, and it had to stay with me. And this being cried loudly and prayed loudly. So it must have been in a bad way. And at some point, he went out on a hiking tour, as I mentioned, beings sometimes do this. And when later on, when he should have come back, well, thank God, the being did not return. When I then asked Ernesto how his arrival over there had been, he replied, I don't actually know, but I suddenly found myself standing on a large lawn that was about as big as a football pitch. and at the edge of it, there were some relatives and some acquaintances standing around. And I was so happy to see them, and I greeted them warmly. They all had died quite a long time before. The acquaintances from our village were also there, and immediately this spirit came and took me with it. And I tell you, it was a matter of seconds, and I was gone. And thereupon, I was in this house where I am still now. This residential estate you are describing is relatively barren? That's quite true, and it did make me wonder. It's probably a sphere where you really can't imagine heavenly life. But that's also why this being, who was trying to shake Ernesto awake, came and wanted him to take steps. And in this context, I would have liked to say something to him, but at this point, my guardian spirit immediately gave me a sign that I shouldn't say anything. But nevertheless, I wanted to let something flow in, something that might stimulate his thoughts. So I asked him, Ernesto, do you want me to pray for your wife? Thereupon he looked at me in surprise, and I continued, yes, indeed. Praying, because praying gives light and strength, and your wife has children and grandchildren, and she has a lot to do with them. He, however, was just looking at me and didn't grasp at all what I was saying. What is also noteworthy for me was his clothing. So I asked him what kind of suit all these beings were wearing here, and he replied that when he arrived, he was still wearing the same street clothes as when he had arrived at the hospital. And after only being in the hospital for a short time, and thereafter being there in this other dimension, the street clothes were somehow suddenly gone. And he was wearing what everyone else was wearing in this sphere. And this was a kind of long robe, most comparable to a capuchin robe. But what he also noticed was that these robes were made of very different quality of materials. One robe was made of a finer cloth material, the other robe of coarser material, whereas the color of these robes was almost the same. Others in turn were wearing heavy robes, so these would have been the differences. But in this case too, after some time had passed, we just had a quick look at each other, and suddenly he was gone. You said that the Spirit has told you that he was given leave to visit the earth. Yes, that's right. Are these beings in this other dimension tied to a certain order structure? Yes, indeed, there are very different order structures there. And well, as to him, I have a certain feeling that he got there and has to stay there, and that he can't easily go back to earth. I have already experienced spirits for whom it is very easy to get back to earth. And I have also tried to get some here, for example, when I wanted to discuss something with them and the like. There are some who are just allowed to return to earth, and this repeatedly. And there are some that I can't reach mentally, and I had the distinct feeling that these are not allowed to do so at all. Did you experience any other encounters of this kind? Yes, with Margaret. I also described her in one of my first books, and she came by during Easter this year, 2023. In the first two books I wrote in 2017, I also mentioned her because she was with me for a particularly long time. We also knew Margaret from earthly life. We met her 2, 3, or 4 times a year in a club, and we got to know her as a friendly colleague. And then she suddenly passed away and came to me, and we were talking about this and that. And she also came to my house. And I asked her, "Why aren't you with your life partner?" Whereupon she said, "He doesn't hear me, and he doesn't see me," and so on. And just now, in this Easter season, she returned. And I asked her, "How are you? Are you well? And what are you doing over there?" She then told me that she would be working now in a news center over there. Actually, a very similar job to the one she had on Earth. On Earth, she worked in an information center, and now in the other world in a news center. And there, messages coming from Earth are received, and these messages can be recognized by the otherworldly ones as a kind of light ribbon. And if there is something like a luminous nodule or something like that placed on a light ribbon, then they know that this is an urgent message. And then they can pull a kind of chip out of it. And this chip is then passed on to a messenger, and is then passed on again by this messenger. Well, at this point, she couldn't explain it to me properly, and I am just simply saying it as she said. So there is still a superior guardian angel there to advise what kind of and how much of a person's worries and needs are contained in this chip, how much one may or should help, or what is right, or what can be granted according to the spiritual laws. Such urgent messages are passed on to such a committee, but the process for responses is a different one. The answers follow, again, a different process. And she then said what she is most happy about is when she can go through the path of light to her home, her house, where she is living when she is not working. And she also brought with her 3 photos, one of them showing the little house where she lives and where everything is overgrown with flowers. And it was all moving in the photo, as if it was blowing in a gentle breeze. I turned it round and looked at it from behind, because in a way, it was also a kind of video under these circumstances. And then she showed me another photo, showing the meeting place in this sphere with various seating areas, where they can meet and chat and talk happily. The third photo showed a kind of columned hall, but it was disproportionately high, and it had some kind of openings at the top. And she explained to me that this is a meeting and cultural place, and of course also a prayer hall for praising God by means of beautiful music and everything that goes with that, and that the tower would be so high and would have all these openings, because from there the message is sent out by means of light beams into the wide plain as to what time which event would take place in this hall. I then asked her, "How was your arrival over there?" She replied that she actually hadn't noticed the dying process at all. Thereafter, she was with me, and I would have known that, and in fact, I still remember that. And then suddenly, after the funeral service, she was over there. Actually, right there in this sphere where the flowers are. And she saw her mother there, but she actually was so woozy and exhausted that she was propped up and put on a sofa somewhere, whereupon she had a good sleep. And according to her estimate, she slept for weeks, but she didn't know exactly for how long she slept. Afterwards, there were teachings or instruction as part of a basic course or something like that. And for this reason, she had been assigned to the job that she has now. And she had received the message that she would be assigned another job sooner or later. And because she was wearing a rather beautiful robe in a glossy yellow or beige, I asked her, "Are you in one of the higher levels now? Or how would you define this?" And she answered me, "I have been told that I am in an intermediate level." Is this environment clearly more beautiful than the one of Ernesto? Yes, of course. It's much nicer here. But about 2 days after this experience, I was sitting, pondering and thinking to myself, well, such lush vegetation seems to be too lush for me. Whereupon my guardian spirit told me, these are medicinal plants. Everything is overgrown with medicinal plants. And this is the way it is intended. Because deceased people who were very seriously ill and also had to take a lot of chemicals come to this level, he said, and further, and the spirit energy body of these people is still damaged, so that they are in need of these medicinal plants, but they also still have their tasks and are pursuing their work here. And after their work, they are again completely surrounded by their healing plants. And all this is a long, long healing process. And it is also quite ideally arranged this way, with these lush healing plants for these deceased people. Coming back again to these messages that are coming up from Earth, what are those messages? These are messages, as Margaret explained to me. People are accompanied by their guardian angels, and people do have their worries and hardships. and as a rule, they pray for help. And a guardian angel is, after all, very concerned about his protege, and he can pass on the prayer. But subsequently, it still has to be exactly clarified what it's all about, because spiritual laws are very precise. People's life plans are also very precise, and it might occur that people have to face their worries, but it is also that the spiritual world is weighing the option for them. I also wrote in one of my books that all this is not so easy. Everything has to be clarified first, and this is why a guardian angel, even if I can actually talk to him easily, sometimes cannot give an answer. But then maybe an answer comes after a day, or maybe there is no answer at all. But this, again, also has a meaning. So they, the guardian angels, have to clarify everything with higher powers, and no one can act independently. That is not possible. Elisabeth, in our preliminary talk, you spoke about a further encounter. It was an encounter with Irene. So on an Easter Sunday, when I was at home, I was looking out into nature early in the morning, and I saw from one perspective a very bright being. And this was such a bright white as we do not know on earth at all. And this being was pushed from the back by a person. And I then caught sight of Irene, whom I also knew very well from earthly life. And I was happy to see her. And then, well, my first thought was that she suffered from dementia when she was in earthly life. And she reacted immediately saying, "Oh, you know, that wasn't so important." And I asked her further, "How are you doing over there? How do you feel?" And her answer was, "You know, it wasn't as heavenly over there as we imagine heaven to be. But I am very happy. We also have to attend schools there, and there are beautiful but strict beings there who explain the plan of salvation and redemption and the spiritual laws. And we have to deepen our knowledge. We have to learn and to learn again. And then we have to stand in front of the class in order to repeat it all from the heart as to how it actually is. And then, when we can do that, and they are happy with us, we have to go down to the lower levels where it is much less beautiful than it is on our own level. We have to pass on this knowledge to these beings there. But these beings have to be comforted and taken care of, and so on. And you have to keep pouring in some of this knowledge and have a lot of patience for them to understand it, at least to some extent. But dealing that way with the spiritual is so beautiful. We have a lot of time, so we can explain it all again and again. And Irene was even allowed to tell about her life on earth, when she was in India, and in this ashram, in this Buddhist center, and how she enjoyed praying and chanting together with all these people from all over the world. And I then made further inquiries and found out that Buddhism is vibrating in violet, and that Christianity is vibrating in white. But Irene was all for this Buddhism and was traveling there again and again. And all this they can talk about in this lower level, and thereafter they come back again and can have rest and things like that. And afterwards they have to attend school again and again. And since she was a teacher in her earthly life, she really liked that very much. May I come back to Irene? She had dementia while she was alive. And does this mean that dementia will be gone in the hereafter? I didn't ask her about the initial phase. She didn't tell me anything about her arrival over there either, but she immediately said that it didn't bother her any longer. In terms of healing energetics, dementia is something where the right hemisphere of the brain is energetically impaired. The emotional level remains, as everyone has to do with dementia knows. And in spirit, this is not a factor when it is about the spirit body. It is similar to an amputation, because when a person has arrived in the hereafter as a spirit body, the spirit body will immediately be complete. This doesn't affect the spirit body, I'd say, but I still should get more profound information from my guardian angel about it. But from my understanding, or as I see things, it is not a problem. According to what you say, everyone has their own experiences in different environments over there. Is the hereafter so big, so diverse indeed? Yes, of course. The messages that have already been brought to me are of a huge spectrum, from the simplest levels to more beautiful levels. But as a human being, you don't hear anything about the most beautiful levels anyway. But I have the feeling that each to his own is satisfied and grateful in terms of their own claim as to how they are welcomed over there, and also as to what they are taught over there. And I think that no human being has to be afraid of death, because if people have lived reasonably correctly, they inevitably are integrated into the vibration which corresponds to them, because their own vibration is based on a magnetic reality. And if a spiritual being thinks intensively about the earth, and if it is a free spirit, as it is being said, then it can come to earth again from time to time, have a look around at the relatives in order to find out where intercession is necessary, so that help can be given here and there, or something like that. Well, it's all just simply a transition, with the earth being a testing station, and the spiritual world our real home. It's actually that simple. And not a single one in my book, containing more than 70 incidents, complained that dying was horrible or told me that life on the other side was unbearable. Everyone is satisfied in their own way, even if they might have something to complain about. So I have also made some notes again about a certain maladjusted individual who didn't find enough luxury over there. And this is precisely because he was living in such great luxury on earth. So the way you describe it then, we can have complete trust in the spiritual world. Yes, of course, because every human being is accompanied from the cradle to the grave and throughout their entire life. And in the end, people are accompanied over. And I have found out from the many, many messages that I have received and that I have written down, that everyone was happy and got to a level that more or less suited them. And I am so happy that you are bringing this out to a wider public, so that people lose their fear of transition, because the earth is our testing ground, and our real home is over there in the other world. And I am just happy that it's like that. Elisabeth, thank you for this interview. Thanks to you also.